I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry to collaborate on a close, but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers House in our Arts Cafe by Bethany Swann, writer, creative collaborator, fourth-year PhD candidate in the English department here at Penn, whose research focuses on the intersection of Asian diasporas and contemporary poetry and poetics, and who has recently been writing a chapter-length essay about how diasporic modes of knowing and being in Don Mi Choi's DMZ colony challenge assumptions about the so-called subject of lyric reading, and who is currently the regional co-chair of Kundiman Northeast. And by Jonathan Dick, a doctoral candidate in English here at Penn, specializing in 19th and 20th century literature and literary criticism, whose dissertation is about how we narrate environmental and social transition and why certain figures of speech, like the pathetic fallacy, are treated by aesthetic objects and cultural criticism as an obstacle to it, and who here with us today is participating in, we think, his fourth episode of PoemTalk, and by Kate Colby, a Boston-born poet who lives in Providence, Rhode Island, a longtime friend of the Writers' House and one of the co-teachers of ModPo, our open online course, author of a number of books of poetry, 9, I think, to be exact. We four have gathered here today to talk about a poem by Nguyen titled Long Light. The poem has been collected in the book Red Juice. I'm going to hold that up, too, for those watching the video. For those listening on audio, you just have to sort of imagine me holding up this fabulous book published by Wave, Red Juice, Poems, 1998-2008. A recording of the poem comes from Wa's Pen Sound author page and was performed during a reading at the St. Bonaventure Visiting Poets Series on March 22nd, 2016. So here now is Nguyen reading her poem, Long Light.
Long light. Long light. Super Bowl Sunday 2006. Due to escape the present. Lying on a recycled plastic outdoor carpet near profuse clover and the water meter. In the dream, Heather marries a heart surgeon in heaven. We need to empty the ash from our chimenea, peely bark on the sycamore tree, waxing gibbous moon. There are rhetorical happenings written directly on a flower. Can love everyone?
Jonathan, how do the parts, the stanza sections, interoperate? I mean, one way to read this, obviously, is extremely paratactic. So each one is a new scene. We were just talking about Ray Armantrout. This one reminds me in the sense of the way Ray Armantrout handles her sections, often by putting an asterisk or something. Is that the right way to read it? It's obviously not the only way, but is that how you read it?
That's not how I read it. And for the audiences, parataxis is a rhetorical feature in language that refers to things said one after another without any grammatical connectives. Or in a quotation that I really like, parataxis, like history, is one damn thing after another. And we can read Long Light like that insofar as each clause seems to be separate from the clause that both precedes and follows it. But I'm actually thinking about this poem more as an occasional poem, which is to say a poem that's written in commemoration of a specific event, the event named in the first line, Super Bowl Sunday 2006. There are certain points across Long Light that orient the perspective at a particular moment in time, a moment in which the speaker is lying, for instance, outside, looking at the water meter, looking at various things that sort of catch their attention. So I think you could read it paratactically, but for me, it's all one continuous narrative commemorating this moment on Super Bowl Sunday where the speaker collapses outside and sort of looks at the things around them. That's at least how I was thinking
Very
about
cool. No, great way to start. Bethany, do you want to respond to that? Did you read it at least some of the time as paratactic separate sections, different scenes?
Actually, just listening to why read it, I heard something that I hadn't noticed before, and I think that the way she sort of like almost added Long Light and then Super Bowl Sunday 2006. It almost like occurred to me as an enjammed title, the whole thing. And the way that I formally read this poem, at first I looked at it and I was like, oh, there's a quatrain and then there's some sort of like couplets. But is it a sonnet? Because it is 13 lines, it's missing one. To me, Long Light is being deflected here, and that's evident formally in some of the ways that there are caesuras throughout the kind of like formal units of the poem, stanzas. And so I liked kind of thinking about like, where is that light refracting, or where is it deflecting? What is interrupting that light? And so I like what you said about the kind of discursiveness of paratactic reading.
Kate, our two colleagues here, your predecessor speakers, have just done what I love about spending a lot of time on a poem. Because if you're trying to write or talk about an entire book or a range of years of poetry, as this book is, Red Juice, you're never really going to get to do what we've already done in the first 5 minutes. I mean, basically what's been said is, especially what Bethany just said, is this poem does formally what it's saying. And that's amazing that we got to that so quickly. And I would insist to anybody listening to this thinking, oh, those academics, they sure do that form stuff. I actually would insist that it's not academic at all. It is the way that one would read and experience a poem like this, no matter how experienced you are. Anyway, I'm turning to you for another thought on this. It really is trying to do formally what it's saying, and what would that be? What would it be saying, therefore?
Well, I'm going to read it atomically. Light is not, in fact, continuous, even though it appears that way. It consists of photons, which are discrete packets of energy, and the poem's form replicates that effect of both continuity and discrete moments. And she moves back and forth between images of timelessness and location in time. And that's all wrapped up in the title as well, which captures how the poem exists at wildly different temporal and physical scales.
So I should have looked up Long Light in my dictionary of physics, but what does it refer to in a physics sense?
Well, light is not, in fact, continuous. So it can appear to extend as in time and space, but it is made up of smaller pieces. Mm-hmm. And I also think in the poem it refers to the long shadows of winter, and we're located here on Super Bowl Sunday. We know what time of year it is. The light lengthens as we perceive it.
So we want a poem that does the painterly thing of suggesting vision imagery, but we also really need a poem that talks about duration of time. So Jonathan, would you just point out a few durational references?
One thing that I was quite interested in this poem is its assonance and its consonants, or its repetition of particular vowel or consonant sounds. Super Bowl Sunday is one of those examples, but the big one for me is, in the dream, Heather marries a heart surgeon in heaven. These, repetitive sounds increase the length of a line, even when the line itself is relatively short or truncated. And so, when it comes to marking length at the level of form, that is one way in which it happens, because the poem is itself quite skinny. I'm technically avoiding the question you're asking, but that's
yeah. You have every right to do that. This being your fourth PoemTalk.
It's doing this
If it
so
were your
much has
first,
just helped me avoid the question
avoid
that
my
you're asking.
questions. Yeah, because I mean, let the record show that I barely have a mark on this page. I have not prepared any questions, nor do I ever prepare questions, and nor do the poem talkers expect to have questions prepared in advance, right, Bethany? So here's my question to you. We need to empty the ash. We is a very domestic we, it feels like, and the poem actually is amazingly domestic. There's stuff happening around the house. Is that right? And how does that help you with this fairly abstract idea of light having a duration?
You know, I hadn't thought about the juxtaposition between that line about emptying the ash from the chimenea and the long light. But ash certainly suggests the afterlife of a fire. I just appreciate what the poem is doing by sort of teasing out this binary between the living and the dead, and what's artificial and what is real. And I feel like that's maybe a little bit of what you were touching on earlier, Kate, when you mentioned the shadows being contrasted with the light. And so there's something archetypal at work in that domestic we. And it's also the first really pronoun and signpost that we get of any sort of poetic voice.
In fact, if one were to read it with some kind of strict grammatical sense, the one or ones who are lying on the outdoor carpet could be the we. Unlikely, but it could be. Kate, you want to take it from here? What's happening?
I think the ash is central to the poem in that it's an object that barely exists in the presence. It's the aftermath or the upshot of a fire in the chimenea, but here it also betokens a future in which it will be emptied. And it echoes, there's a lot of afterlife in the poem. There's heaven, there's the evanescence of the flower that will still carry these marks of rhetorical happenings. And that an afterlife is both a thing that comes after life and a life after death. It's kind of a two-way word that holds so much of the activity of this poem, which keeps two very different kinds of balls in the air at all times.
Wow. Jonathan, what are you thinking? You're obviously thinking of something.
I'm actually thinking about something that Bethany mentioned earlier, which is speculatively what would happen if we treated this poem as a sonnet. It does have 13 lines, while it does write sonnets elsewhere with 13 lines. And speculatively, if we want to run with that, this line would be where the volta in the sonnet hits. And for readers, the volta is the moment of a sonnet, either English or Italian, in which the argument switches or we become more philosophical. And it's making me sort of conscious of the fact that after this turning point, when something happens to the ash in the chimney, there's a fire that has ended, and there's a moment here that something is happening to sort of change the context of the poem. And I guess I'm running with Bethany's suggestion and wanting to notice how after this moment, the poem becomes increasingly philosophical. We move from grounded descriptions about the place, the time, the space, to questions about love, which sneaks in unsuspected with a particular rhetorical force.
Can I ask any or all of the three of you, let's go back to Super Bowl Sunday, because what's happening here is that there is an escape from, presumably, Super Bowl Sunday, and from that indoorsness, which is really oppressive for those of us who've done Super Bowl Sunday earnestly. It's a long indoor day on a short day of the year, and it's cold, and it's going to be cold in Canada. But there seems to be a lot of outdoorsness. Maybe the outdoor carpet is not indoors or even in a porch, but outdoors. And then we have the chimenea, we've just learned is probably outdoors. And then, of course, the sycamore, which is a London plane, which is a city tree, an urban tree, outdoors. So am I onto something at all, Kate? The do is in quotes, do to escape from the present. What's happening? Is there a motion outward?
Well, I think there's a indoor-outdoor binary, certainly. But the whole thing puts me in mind of Zeno's paradox, where we have this suspended moment with all this incremental movement inside of it. And it does move between indoors, outdoors, momentary information and eternity. Heather, I just assumed Heather was Locklear. And we're in some kind of soap opera.
Wait, you have to explain that reference, though.
Well, I can't really.
Super soap opera
maybe like,
star of the 80s, 90s.
Melrose Place.
Yes.
Some show like that.
But
I think
also
she was
some
also
cop
on
show.
soap operas.
Cop show, too.
I could be wrong. That's a question for one day. But yeah.
In the dream, not Heather's dream, but someone else's dream of Heather.
Well, we don't know if
Yeah.
Heather's having the dream or the poet is having the dream.
But that's ha-ha, right? That's just funny.
It is, and is it? It isn't.
Marrying a heart
because-
surgeon, that's like everybody's mother's dream, I think.
Sure. But there's some perceptual confusion in here. Who's having the dream? Where is the world? Which of us are in which worlds?
And if we don't read it paratactically, Jonathan, then there may be a connection between the urgency, the hidden urgency of this ha-ha, not so funny, marrying a heart surgeon, maybe because there is a heart problem, and then there is this sudden need to empty the ash. Mm-hmm. Those things are connected in a kind of beautiful and haunting way, no?
Well, I mean, it goes back to a point that you mentioned earlier, which is that domesticity sort of sneaks into this poem in its middle, but between either extremely ordinary reflections about the place and the Super Bowl Sunday, and extremely philosophical meditations about what can be written on a flower, which is something quite interesting to think about that I'm sure we'll return to. But one thing that I sort of started to think about with respect to Heather and the heart surgeon is that, in some respects, there's a like a wish or desire in that moment for someone who can heal a heart, which gets brought back at the end when love is questioned as something that people can have, that people can have equally. And so, Heather, who marries a heart surgeon, her heart's going to be just fine, but other people's hearts might not. And I think that to me is a really that to me is a way of grounding what would otherwise be paratactic references in something that is fixed.
Kate, it's one thing to assert there are, which is a very sort of a faux passive way of constructing this line. There are rhetorical happenings, and then parentheses written directly onto a flower. What kind of writing is that? Have you ever tried it?
Nope. What strikes me about rhetorical happenings is it's it can be read as an oxymoron. And to make a meta statement, a poem is a rhetorical happening. It's an action that is taking place on the page and in some way in the world, but not physically, actually. And the idea of writing onto a flower, we writers like to imagine that our words are immortal, but a flower is so very mortal and is going to fade any moment. So that line there are rhetorical happenings written directly onto a flower, captures so much of the process of writing a poem and one's thinking about it, its life in the world and its longevity.
Longevity, that's the perfect word for this moment. So, Bethany and everyone, I'm going to say I feel some tension here, not among us, in the poem, possibly among or between the we, the elements of the we, the people of the we, the peopling of the we. There is something going on inside, and there is an escape. And that escape is the occasion for a poem. So rhetoric does happen when it is going away from something on this late Sunday in January. And the last two lines, which we're going to turn to now, are a plaint, I think, maybe. I'm going to overread this, Bethany. And I think that there's a problem that has to be solved or addressed by the poet on this particular day, in this particular short day. And do reminds us of all the things that people say about poetry in the negative. Like, what does poetry fucking do? It doesn't do anything. Poetry doesn't make anything happen. You want to do? Go back inside and the Steelers will win. That's real. And what you're doing is not real. All right, I'm overreading that, but I want to get to the last line. The question is, what's the answer to the question? If there is this tension, if I'm right about this escape, and if I'm right about where writing happens, it doesn't happen inside on that particular day. It's going to happen between and among the things that one sees, thinks, dreams of, and worries about. I think peeling bark on the sycamore is something what sycamore and London planes, they peel. It feels like, oh, this thing is dying. I have a sycamore right out in front, a London plane right out in front of my house here in West Philadelphia, and it peels, and everybody says, your tree is dying. So that's part of it. Anyway, did I buy you enough time to think about this, Bethany?
I think so.
Okay, what do you think? Am I wrong? I see tension here.
I see tension. I also see urgency. In the immediacy, we need to empty the ash from our chimenea. And I wonder...
The stuff we have to do that we're not doing.
Yeah, and there's something about the need for that to be clean or empty, or that space to be open, that I wonder if that sort of like emotion or urgency can apply to that last couplet, can love everyone. And I don't think that there's a resolute answer. And I think part of the play with Rhetorical Happenings is not about definitive questions and answers, but just about kind of meandering and not resolving things. And so can love everyone.
Nice move there at the end. Kate, okay, can love everyone. Here's a question for you. If someone were to read this poem, maybe a student or, some 8th grader that would say, okay, I understand everything, but can you paraphrase those last 2 lines? How would you do it?
I can't, but I can observe
And
a few
won't.
things.
Remember, it's your 8th grader who's asking.
Yeah. Well, this poem has kind of an incorporative spirit. So it is most literally asking the question, can one love everything, even the ugly plastic carpet and the ash and the,
Peeling
kind
sycamore.
of junk of our lives.
Yes.
But there's also a way to read it as an inversion that comes off almost like a broken English and makes love a noun or a verb, makes everyone potentially a noun or a verb, so that it can be read in so many ways that point inward but also incorporate everything.
Jonathan, your thought on this part of our conversation?
Coming to this last line, in which rhetorical happenings, a word that sort of Kate nicely reminds us is something that we might say about a poem, is here something that is not just written directly onto a flower, but seems to emerge from it. And when we look back at the rest of the poem, the escape from that present, the turn away from the Super Bowl Sunday, is all based around semi-natural imagery, outdoor carpets that are plastic, but also bark on a sycamore tree and a waxing gibbous moon. And so this makes me sort of want to think about whether there's something eco-poetical happening here, and whether against the claim, and for readers, Auden is the person who says that poetry does nothing. Against the claim that poetry does nothing, perhaps there's something here about the way that poetry does something for the environment. I don't know if that is necessarily something that this poem wants to say, but I don't think poems want to say anything specific. So I'm going to say that.
I love it. Okay, final thoughts. Let's go, each of us. One more thing you wanted to say about this poem, but didn't have a chance to yet. Kate, do you have one?
It's a sad poem, I think. And Jonathan mentioning that the book was cast in light of eco poetry made me realize that that long light happens at the end of the day in winter, and it has a longing to it.
Long light in winter, it's slant light. It's not long in duration because there's less light, but it's a slant.
Correct. I guess I meant the long shadows, which is
long shadows,
the inverse of light, what light casts. But in both its specificity and its philosophical rigor, it's a very sad and longing poem to me.
Jonathan, final thoughts?
I think at the same time, I mean, I at least was also thinking about it optimistically. We're reading this poem in, oh God, what day is it today? Like November 12th or something like that. A day which is sort of 2 or 3 days before the clocks turn back, making the light shorter. But Super Bowl Sunday is an event that happens in February as the days, the short days of winter growing progressively longer. And so there's something for me about, this poem being on the cusp of a daylight savings kind of thing that also makes it vaguely optimistic. But I think it's up in the air, especially with the last couplet and the ambiguity of its subject and the possibility for love, whether that optimism, suggested by the day is actually something that can carry out into everyday life.
Thank you. Bethany, final thought?
Yeah, I think that just looking at this again, I'm really moved and interested by all of the abundance of images that are emergent or forms that are not whole or not complete. So like the ash and like the waxing gibbous moon. And I think that there's something in those forms that are broken or not complete or fragmented in some way, that the poet is kind of trying to signal. And I think it's significant, the turn to those images, instead of the neat kind of reparation of a dream world in which, the heart surgeon in heaven and the kind of like reparation that signals that cannot necessarily happen like in the present of this long light.
Thank you. I agree that it's a sad poem, and I agree that the love at the end is crucial, and I just want to riff for a second on those last two lines. It can mean, as Kate suggested, can one love everything? In an almost William Carlos Williams, the world is full of junk and broken things, and I still can find something that is shining there. And it is kind of a junky. I mean, it is true that if you live in a high-end, high-rise, that you could have the recycled plastic outdoor carpet, but I think it's meant here. There's a water meter. There's the ash. It's kind of like not a beautiful, and I think it's an urban place, and not a beautiful urban place. And that last line could be, is there something everyone can love here? Is love possible? Is there such a thing as love in a place like this? And the escape has something to do with it, because the Super Bowl is, at least for me, the equivalent of a recycled plastic outdoor carpet, and one cannot escape it. That's all the recycled plastic outdoor carpet we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania right here, and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks to my guest, Jonathan Dick. Come on, let's hear it for Jonathan Dick. And Bethany Swann, and Kate Colby, and PoemTalk's directors and engineers, Paul Burke over there with the Phillies hat. Why are you wearing a Phillies hat? And Zach Cardner, who is the best at this. Do you have any applause left? And PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing Zach Cardner. Next time on PoemTalk, I'll be talking with Divya Victor, Dag Wubchet, and Whitney Tretien about two poems from Doug Kearney's new book, or actually not so new book, but fabulous book, Show, S-H-O. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of PoemTalk.